touch her, and drag her out. The words landed sharp and clean, slicing through the low hum of clinking glasses and muted jazz like a command the room had been trained to obey. For a second, everything froze. Forks hovered midair. A waiter stopped mid-step, one polished shoe still lifted an inch above the marble floor. The chandelier light above reflected in the glass walls, cold and distant, casting thin lines across every face turned toward the center of the room. Naomi Carter didn't move. She stood near the edge of table 12, one hand resting lightly against the back of an empty chair, the other still holding a folded linen napkin. Her uniform was simple, pressed, but worn at the seams, the faint scent of lemon cleaner clinging to her sleeves. A drop of water slid slowly from the rim of a nearby glass, hit the table, and spread into a thin, silent stain. Across from her, Richard Halston leaned back in his chair like the space itself belonged to him, one arm draped over the leather, fingers tapping once against the wood as if impatient with gravity itself. His suit caught the light perfectly, every line sharp, every detail deliberate. He didn't raise his voice again. He didn't have to. People like him never did. Naomi's eyes lifted, steady, meeting his without urgency, without apology. Not defiant. Just present. The kind of presence that didn't ask permission to exist. "You don't want to do that," she said quietly. No edge. No fear. Just a statement, placed gently into the silence like something fragile but unbreakable. A few heads turned sharper at that. Someone near the bar exhaled under their breath. Richard's lips curved. Not quite a smile. More like recognition of a game he believed he had already won. "I think I do," he replied, voice smooth, almost amused, as if the moment existed for his entertainment. Near the entrance, two security guards shifted their weight. Black suits, earpieces catching the light. One of them lifted a hand to his ear, listening. The other glanced toward Naomi, then quickly away, like eye contact itself had become a decision he wasn't ready to make. The music didn't stop, but it felt farther away now, like it had been pushed behind a wall no one could see. Naomi didn't step back, didn't step forward. Her fingers loosened from the napkin, letting it rest on the table beside her. The air felt heavier, thicker, like something unseen had entered the room and taken a seat no one had invited. Richard leaned forward slightly now, elbows brushing the edge of the table, voice lower, sharper. "This is a private establishment," he said, "and you are out of place." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled. Final. Meant to define the space, to redraw its boundaries with a single sentence. Naomi's gaze didn't shift. Not to the guards. Not to the crowd. Just him. There was something in her expression then, something almost imperceptible, like the faint reflection of light before dawn. Not anger. Not hurt. Something closer to recognition. As if she had seen this exact moment before, in a different room, with different people, and knew exactly how it ended. One of the guards exhaled, slow, controlled, his hand still pressed to his earpiece. A quiet voice crackled through, too soft for anyone else to hear. His jaw tightened. The second guard glanced at him again, waiting. Neither of them moved. 5 seconds passed. Then 6. Long enough for the silence to stretch into something uncomfortable. Long enough for the illusion of control to begin to slip, just slightly, like a glass set too close to the edge of a table. Naomi tilted her head a fraction, not in challenge, but in something quieter. "I told you," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the hum of the room. "You don't want to do that." And this time, it wasn't a warning. It sounded like certainty. The guard's hand stayed pressed to his earpiece, but his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a line of tension pulling through his shoulders and settling somewhere deeper. The second guard glanced at him again, this time longer, searching for a cue that did not come. Around them, the room tried to breathe again, but it could not quite find the rhythm. A glass was set down too carefully. A chair leg scraped softly against the marble, then stopped, as if even sound itself was being watched. Richard Halston noticed it then, not the silence, but the hesitation. His fingers stopped tapping. His gaze flicked toward the guards, sharp now, measuring. "Well?" he said, the word landing heavier than before. It was not louder, but it carried weight, expectation, the kind that had always been answered without question. The first guard lowered his hand slowly from his ear. His eyes did not go to Richard. They stayed on Naomi, steady, almost cautious. "Sir," he said, voice controlled, "we need a moment." A ripple moved through the nearby tables. Not loud, not obvious, but present. A shift. The kind people feel before they understand. Richard leaned back again, but the movement lacked its earlier ease. "You have already had a moment," he replied, each word precise. "Do your job." Naomi did not look at the guards. She did not need to. Her attention remained on Richard, calm, unbroken. The reflection of the chandelier traced faint lines across her eyes, catching something there that was not fear, not even resistance, but something steadier, like someone standing exactly where they chose to stand. "It is all right," she said quietly, though it was unclear who the words were meant for. "Take your time." The second guard exhaled through his nose, a small sound, almost invisible, but it carried tension with it. He shifted his stance, weight moving from one foot to the other, then back again, as if the ground beneath him had become uncertain. "Sir," the first guard repeated, this time slower, "we cannot proceed." The words settled into the space between them, and for the first time, they did not dissolve. They stayed. Richard's expression did not change immediately. That was the unsettling part. The stillness. Then something in his jaw tightened, a faint line forming where confidence had always lived untouched. "Cannot?" he echoed, the word unfamiliar in his mouth. "You work for me." The guard's gaze finally shifted, meeting his, but only briefly, like a boundary he was careful not to cross for too long. "Not in this situation, sir." A murmur, soft and scattered, passed through the room. Someone near the window leaned forward slightly. Another guest lowered their phone just enough to listen without being seen listening. The air felt different now, thinner, sharper, like the moment before a storm decides whether to break. Richard's eyes flicked back to Naomi, searching now, not for permission, but for explanation. "What exactly do you think is happening here?" he asked, the smoothness in his voice beginning to fracture at the edges. Naomi's lips parted slightly, but she did not answer right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough for it to mean something. When she finally spoke, her voice remained soft, almost gentle. "I think," she said, "you are about to understand something you have not had to understand before." The words did not rise. They did not challenge. They simply existed, and that made them harder to dismiss. Behind her, the bar lights dimmed slightly as the system adjusted to the evening setting, casting warmer tones across the room, but the warmth did not reach the center where they stood. The first guard straightened a fraction, his decision settling into place. "We have been instructed to stand down," he said, more firmly now. "Effective immediately." Richard blinked once, slow, as if recalibrating. "By who?" he asked. The question hung there, sharper than anything he had said before, because for the first time, it was not a command. It was a need. The guard did not answer right away. His eyes shifted once more toward Naomi, then back to Richard. "Sir," he said carefully, "you already know the name." And in that small pause that followed, something invisible shifted completely, like a door unlocking somewhere no one had noticed before. The name did not come out loud, but it moved through the room anyway, carried in the way people held their breath, in the way eyes shifted without turning heads. Richard Halston did not blink this time. He held the guard's gaze for a fraction longer than before, searching, calculating, as if the answer might reveal itself if he stared hard enough. Then his attention snapped back to Naomi. For the first time since he spoke, he really looked at her. Not the uniform, not the place she stood. Her. The way she held her shoulders, relaxed but unmoving. The way her eyes did not dart, did not ask, did not yield. Something about it pressed against a memory he could not quite reach. "No," he said quietly, almost to himself, a single word that did not carry the same certainty it once did. Naomi watched him without expression, but there was a softness now, something almost like patience. Not for him to understand, but for him to arrive at it on his own. Around them, the restaurant had shifted into something else entirely. Conversations had thinned into silence. Even the music felt distant, like it had been left behind in another room. A server near the bar stood with a tray balanced in both hands, unmoving, eyes fixed on the space between Naomi and Richard. The guard took a small step back, not retreating, but creating distance, as if acknowledging that whatever was happening no longer belonged to him. "Sir," he said, lower now, We were given a direct override. The word override lingered. It did not belong in a place like this, among polished glass and curated menus. It belonged to systems, to structures Richard had built his life mastering. His jaw tightened again, but this time it was not anger. It was friction, something not aligning. That is not possible, Richard replied, though the edge had dulled. There are no overrides above my authorization here. Naomi tilted her head slightly, the movement small, almost gentle. There are always things above what we think we control, she said. Her voice did not rise, but it carried, settling into the room with a weight that did not need volume. Richard's gaze sharpened, not dismissive now, but focused. Who are you? The question landed differently than the one before. It was not a challenge. It was a fracture. Naomi did not answer right away. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the guard, then back to Richard, as if confirming something had already been decided. The guard swallowed, his hand hovering near his radio again, but he did not touch it. Sir, he said carefully, this directive came from Central. A faint shift moved through the room again. Central. The word carried its own gravity, undefined but understood. Richard's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface, sharp suit, steady posture, everything still intact on the outside. But something behind his eyes had changed. Central does not involve itself in situations like this, he said, slower now, each word tested before it was released. Naomi's gaze softened just enough to notice. It does, she replied, when it matters. A long second passed. Then another. Somewhere in the distance, a glass slipped from someone's hand and tapped softly against the table, not breaking, just enough to remind everyone that time was still moving. Richard leaned forward, elbows resting against the table, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier ease. You are standing in my establishment, interrupting my evening, and you expect me to believe that an entire security chain has decided to ignore me because of you. Naomi did not flinch. Not because of me, she said. Because of what you are about to do. The words settled deeper than anything else she had said. Richard's breath slowed, just slightly. His mind moved, fast, searching through layers he did not often question. Contracts, agreements, names, faces. Then something flickered, faint but persistent, like a light behind frosted glass. Naomi watched it happen. She did not help him. She did not interrupt. She simply waited. And in that waiting, the power in the room shifted again, quieter this time, but more permanent, like a door that had already opened and would not close the same way again. The flicker behind Richard Halston's eyes did not disappear this time. It stayed, faint but insistent, like something knocking from the inside. His fingers loosened slightly from the edge of the table, then tightened again, as if he could regain control through pressure alone. The room did not move. It waited. Naomi Carter shifted her weight just enough for the fabric of her sleeve to catch the light, revealing a small, almost invisible crease near the cuff, the kind that comes from long hours, not carelessness. She did not fix it. She did not need to. What am I about to do? Richard asked, but the question no longer carried command. It carried distance, like he was asking from somewhere just outside himself. Naomi watched him carefully now, not with judgment, but with something closer to recognition. You are about to make a decision you cannot take back, she said. Her voice remained even, but there was something underneath it now, something quieter, heavier. Not a warning, a memory. One of the guards shifted again, this time stepping fully back, creating a clear space between them and the center of the room. It was subtle, but it changed the geometry of everything. The distance was no longer physical. It was symbolic. Richard noticed it. Of course he did. He noticed everything when it came to control. But this was different. This was control slipping without permission. Enough, he said, though softer than before. This is unnecessary. The words sounded practiced, like something he had said before in rooms where outcomes were predictable. But nothing about this moment felt predictable anymore. Naomi's eyes did not leave his. It is always necessary when someone decides. Who belongs and who does not, she replied. A breath caught somewhere behind them. Someone near the window looked down at their table, suddenly very interested in nothing at all. The weight of her words did not come from volume. It came from truth, the kind that does not argue. Richard's jaw tightened again, but this time it held something else beneath it. Not anger. Resistance. You are making this into something it is not, he said. Naomi shook her head once, slow, deliberate. No, she said. It already was. The guard's radio crackled softly, a brief burst of static, then silence again. His hand hovered near it, but he did not reach. He did not need to. The instruction had already been given. It was not changing. Richard leaned back slightly, his posture adjusting, recalibrating, searching for a position that made sense again. But the room did not respond the way it used to. It did not realign around him. It held, still, watching. You think this is about power, he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, as if narrowing the situation might make it manageable. Naomi's expression softened just a fraction, enough to register, not enough to shift. No, she said. I think this is about what you believe power gives you the right to do. The distinction settled between them, quiet and precise. Richard's gaze dropped for the first time, not fully, just enough to break the direct line that had held since the beginning. His eyes moved across the table, over the untouched glass, the folded napkin, the reflection of the overhead light bending slightly in the polished surface. For a brief moment, he looked like someone trying to place a memory that refused to stay still. Naomi saw it. She did not interrupt it. She let it happen. Let him move through it on his own. The guard cleared his throat softly, the sound barely audible, but it marked a shift. Sir, he said again, more quietly now, we have been advised to wait for confirmation. Richard looked up, sharper this time. Confirmation of what? The guard hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then answered. Of her clearance. The word landed differently than the others. Clearance. It did not belong to this setting. It belonged to systems Richard understood too well. Systems with levels, with access, with lines that could not be crossed without consequence. Naomi did not react to the word. Not visibly. But something in her stillness deepened, like the final piece of something long set in motion settling into place. Richard's eyes returned to her again, slower this time, more deliberate. And somewhere in that look, the flicker became clearer, like a shape beginning to form out of shadow. Not recognition yet, but close enough to feel. The word clearance did not fade the way the others had. It stayed in the air, quiet but heavy, like something that did not belong to conversation but to consequence. Richard Halston did not move for a full second. Then his eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus, as if something precise had just entered the equation and he needed to isolate it. That is not a designation used here, he said slowly, each word measured, controlled, but the certainty behind them no longer absolute. The guard did not respond immediately. He shifted his stance again, shoulders straightening, as if aligning himself with something larger than the room, something that did not require explanation. It is tonight, sir, he said. Naomi Carter exhaled softly, almost inaudibly, but it marked a change. Not relief. Not victory. Just acknowledgement. The kind that comes when something expected finally arrives. She glanced briefly toward the entrance, then back to Richard, her gaze steady, patient. You built systems, she said, her voice calm, almost reflective. You know how they work. Richard's jaw tightened again, but this time it was different. Not resistance. Recognition pushing against denial. His mind moved faster now, pulling threads, connecting fragments. Clearance. Override. Central. None of those words existed in isolation. Not in his world. Never in his world. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting against the table again, but the posture no longer signaled control. It signaled effort. Who authorized this? He asked, quieter now. The question no longer meant for dominance, but for understanding. Naomi held his gaze. You did, she said. The words landed without force, but they carried more weight than anything else in the room. A faint murmur passed through the nearest tables, quickly swallowed, like people realizing they had reacted too soon. Richard blinked once, slower this time. That is not possible, he said, but the sentence felt thinner now, like it had lost its foundation before it even reached the air. Naomi did not look away. 3 years ago, she continued, her voice steady. You signed an expansion agreement. Multi-site, multi-state. You remember it as numbers. As growth. But there was a clause. Richard's breath caught, just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for him. Naomi's eyes softened, just enough to carry something human through the tension. A clause you insisted on, she said. You called it a safeguard. A way to prevent the wrong kind of decisions from being enforced in your spaces. The guard's radio clicked softly again, a faint confirmation tone, then silence. He did not touch it. He did not need to. Richard's gaze dropped to the table once more, but this time it stayed there longer. His reflection stared back at him, distorted slightly by the curve of the glass. For a moment, he looked like someone seeing a version of himself he had not planned for. That clause, Naomi continued, gave certain individuals the authority to override any directive that violated the standards you claimed to believe in. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls had leaned in just enough to listen. Richard's fingers loosened from the table completely, resting flat against the surface. No tapping, no tension, just stillness. And you are saying, he began, then stopped, the sentence unfinished, because the answer had already begun forming in his mind. Naomi did not rush him. She let the silence hold, let it do the work words did not need to do anymore. When she finally spoke, it was quieter than before, but clearer. I am saying, she said, you created a system that does not answer to power when power forgets what it is supposed to protect. Richard looked up at her again, and this time, the flicker behind his eyes was no longer faint. It was visible, not fully formed, not fully accepted, but undeniable. And in that moment, the room did not feel like his anymore. The realization did not arrive all at once. It moved slowly, like a shadow shifting across a wall, changing shape as it settled into something recognizable. Richard Halston stayed still, his eyes fixed on Naomi, but no longer with authority. Now there was calculation, and beneath it, something less familiar. Discomfort. The kind that did not come from being challenged, but from recognizing the challenge was valid. His breath came in quieter now, measured, as if he were trying to control something internal that had already begun to slip. Around them, the room had stopped pretending to be normal. Conversations no longer tried to resume. Glasses remained untouched. Even the staff, trained to move invisibly, stood at a distance, watching without looking, listening without turning their heads. Naomi did not shift. She did not press forward. She simply stood, allowing the weight of what she had said to exist without interference. You are saying, Richard began again, slower this time, that I built a system designed to stop someone like me. The words sounded unfamiliar, like he was testing them for the first time. Naomi's expression softened, not in agreement, but in understanding. No, she said gently. You built a system designed to stop decisions like this. The distinction was small, but it landed deeper. Richard's gaze dropped again, but this time it did not search the table. It lingered somewhere unfocused, as if he were looking inward instead of outward. His fingers moved slightly, not tapping, not gripping, just adjusting, like someone trying to find balance on unstable ground. The guard nearest the entrance shifted again, then straightened, his posture now firm, resolved. Sir, he said quietly, confirmation has been received. The words did not interrupt. They completed something. Richard looked up slowly. From where? He asked, though his tone had changed again. Less demand. More need. The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered. From executive oversight. The phrase settled differently than central, more specific, more structured. It carried layers Richard understood too well. His jaw tightened once more, but not in resistance. In recognition. Naomi watched him carefully now, her gaze steady, patient, but there was something else beneath it. Not satisfaction, not vindication, something closer to restraint. Like someone holding back words that did not need to be spoken. You signed it, she said quietly. You approved every level of it. You said no environment under your name should ever allow authority to override dignity. The sentence did not accuse. It reminded. Richard inhaled slowly, the breath deeper than before, filling his chest in a way that felt deliberate. He leaned back slightly, the movement slower, heavier, as if the weight of the room had finally settled onto him. And you are, what exactly? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of pretense. Naomi held his gaze. I am one of the people that clause was written for, she said. The words did not rise. They did not need to. They settled into the space between them, clear and immovable. A faint sound came from the bar, a glass being set down too quickly, then adjusted, but it did not break the moment. Nothing could break it now. Richard's eyes searched her face again, but this time not for status, not for hierarchy. For meaning. You are telling me, he said slowly, that the system I created is now protecting you from me. Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the silence hold again, let it stretch just enough for the truth to settle without force. Then she nodded once. I am telling you, she said, that the system is doing exactly what you asked it to do. The words landed quietly, but they changed everything. Richard's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in something closer to release, like tension he did not realize he was carrying had finally found a place to go. His gaze shifted once more, not away, but differently, as if he were seeing the room for the first time without assuming it belonged to him. And in that shift, something fundamental moved, not loud, not dramatic, but permanent, like a line being redrawn where no one could see it, except him. The shift did not announce itself. It did not arrive with sound or movement. It settled quietly, like dust in sunlight, visible only if you were paying attention. Richard Halston exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not just leave the lungs but seemed to release something deeper, something held too long without question. His shoulders lowered another fraction, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not immediately speak. He looked at Naomi Carter again, but the gaze had changed. It no longer measured her position in the room. It tried to understand her presence in it. Naomi noticed. She did not react to it. She simply remained where she was, steady, unhurried, as if the outcome of this moment had never depended on whether he understood quickly or slowly. Around them, the room remained suspended, but the tension had shifted from sharp to heavy, like a storm that had already broken somewhere beyond the horizon. A server near the far wall adjusted her grip on a tray, the faint clink of glass barely audible, but it marked the passage of time. Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his fingers now loosely interlaced, no longer pressing into the surface as if it could anchor him. And what happens now? He asked. The question was quiet, but it carried more weight than any command he had given earlier. Naomi's eyes held his, steady, grounded. That depends on you, she said. The answer did not offer direction. It returned responsibility. Richard's gaze dropped briefly, not to escape, but to think. The polished surface of the table reflected the overhead light again, but now it seemed dimmer, less precise. He watched it for a second, then lifted his eyes back to her. If I say I made a mistake, he said slowly, as if testing each word before allowing it to exist, does that change anything? Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the question settle, let it find its place in the room. A mistake. The word was small, but it carried weight in a space where mistakes were rarely acknowledged. It changes something, she said at last. But not everything. The distinction lingered, quiet but firm. Richard nodded once, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but real. And what does it not change? He asked. Naomi's expression softened again, not in comfort, but in clarity. It does not change what you believed in that moment, she said. And it does not change what that belief does to people who have to stand in front of it. The words did not accuse. They revealed. Richard inhaled again, deeper this time, his chest rising slowly before the breath left him just as controlled. He looked around the room then, not fully, just enough to register the presence of others. The stillness, the attention, the quiet witnessing. For a brief moment, he saw it from the outside, not as the center, as part of it. The guard near the entrance shifted his stance again, but this time it was not uncertainty. It was readiness, not to act, to hold, to maintain what had already been decided. Richard's gaze returned to Naomi. You could have let this happen, he said. You could have walked away, said nothing. Naomi's lips curved just slightly, not a smile, but something close to it. I could have, she said. But then your system would not be real. The sentence landed gently, but it carried a quiet finality. Richard absorbed it, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in resistance, but in thought. So this is not about you, he said. Naomi shook her head once. It is never just about one person, she replied. The room seemed to exhale with her words, a subtle release, like something understood without needing to be spoken aloud. Richard sat back slowly, his posture no longer trying to reclaim space, but adjusting to it. His hands rested on the table, open, no longer controlled, no longer directing. Then what is it about? He asked, the question quieter now, almost reflective. Naomi met his gaze one more time, her voice steady. grounded in something that did not shift with the room. It is about whether what you built means anything when it is inconvenient, she said. The words settled into the silence, and this time, nothing moved to interrupt them. Not the guards, not the staff, not even the faint music in the distance. Because in that moment, the question no longer belonged to Naomi. It belonged to him. The question did not fade after Naomi spoke it. It stayed, suspended in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said that night. Richard Halston did not answer immediately. He could not. For the first time, there was no prepared response, no instinct to redirect or reframe. Just silence. His gaze drifted, not away from her, but past her, as if he were trying to see something that existed behind the moment itself. The polished glass walls reflected the room back at him, but it looked different now. Smaller, quieter, less certain. He inhaled slowly, the breath filling his chest, then leaving just as controlled, but it did not restore what had been there before. I built it to mean something, he said finally, his voice lower, more grounded, but stripped of its earlier authority. Naomi did not move. She let the words settle, let them exist without interruption. Then this is where it proves it, she replied. Her tone did not rise. It did not push. It simply placed the truth where it could not be avoided. Richard's fingers shifted slightly against the table, not gripping, not tapping, just adjusting, as if he were feeling the surface for the first time instead of assuming it would always be there. Around them, the room held its stillness, but the tension had changed again. It was no longer sharp. It was reflective, the kind that made people look inward instead of outward. A faint movement came from the far corner as a guest leaned back in their chair, the soft creak of wood barely audible, but it marked time continuing, even if no one acknowledged it. Richard's eyes returned to Naomi, steady now, but different, less certain, more present. You said it does not change everything, he said. So what does? Naomi's gaze softened, not with sympathy, but with clarity. What you do next, she answered. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not as pressure, but as possibility. Richard nodded once, slowly, the movement deliberate, as if acknowledging something he could not yet fully define. He looked down at the table again, at the glass, the reflection of the overhead light bending across its surface. Then he reached forward, not quickly, not decisively, but with intention, and adjusted the folded napkin Naomi had set down earlier, straightening it without realizing why. The small act hung there, quiet, almost invisible, but it marked something shifting. Naomi noticed. She did not comment. She did not need to. The guard near the entrance shifted again, but this time it was not tension or readiness. It was release. His shoulders lowered slightly, his stance easing, as if the outcome no longer required him to hold the line. Sir, he said quietly, the directive remains in effect. Richard glanced toward him briefly, then nodded, not as a command, but as acknowledgement. I understand, he said, and the words sounded different than anything he had said before, not because of their content, but because of their weight. He looked back at Naomi, his expression no longer searching for position or authority, but for something simpler. Understanding. You were right, he said. The sentence was quiet, almost lost in the room, but it did not need volume. Naomi held his gaze, steady, present. It is not about being right, she said. It is about whether it happens again. The distinction landed gently, but it carried forward, beyond the moment, beyond the room. Richard exhaled again, slower this time, the breath leaving him like something released, not forced. He leaned back in his chair, but the movement no longer claimed space. It settled into it. His hands rested open on the table, no longer directing, no longer controlling. Just there. The room began to breathe again, slowly, carefully, like something fragile returning after being held too long. A glass was lifted. A quiet conversation resumed at the far end. The music, faint and distant, seemed to find its place again. But something had changed, something that would not return to what it was before. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, her posture still calm, still grounded. She did not step away yet, not until the moment was complete. And in that stillness, in that quiet space between what had happened and what would happen next, the meaning of everything that had been built, everything that had been said, rested not in power, but in choice. The moment did not end when the words stopped. It lingered, stretching into the quiet spaces between movement and thought, settling into the room like something that would not be easily undone. Naomi Carter shifted her gaze slightly, not away from Richard, but beyond him, taking in the space as if measuring whether it had returned to itself or become something else entirely. The answer seemed to rest somewhere in between. Richard remained seated, his posture no longer rigid, no longer shaped by expectation, but by something quieter, something less defined. His hands stayed open on the table, fingers relaxed, as if he had finally stopped trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. A server moved cautiously along the far wall, placing a glass down with deliberate care, the soft clink echoing more than it should have. The room had begun to breathe again, but it did so carefully, like it was still unsure of its own rhythm. Naomi glanced back at Richard, her expression steady, but there was a subtle shift now, something that suggested the moment had reached its edge. Not ended, but completed. "You understand," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet confirmation. Richard looked at her, really looked, the kind of look that did not skim the surface but stayed long enough to recognize what it had missed before. He nodded once, slowly. "I do," he replied. And this time, the words held. Naomi held his gaze for a second longer, as if making sure the understanding was not temporary, not convenient, but real. Then she stepped back, just one step, the movement small but significant, like a line being redrawn. The space between them changed again, not with tension, but with distance that felt earned. The guard near the entrance straightened slightly, then relaxed, his attention no longer fixed on Naomi, but returning to the room, as if the situation no longer required intervention. The system had done what it was meant to do. Richard watched Naomi's movement, his eyes following the shift, not with authority, but with awareness. "Will this be reported?" he asked, his voice low, almost reflective, as if the question was less about consequence and more about understanding the full shape of what had happened. Naomi paused, considering, not the answer, but the weight of the question itself. "It already is," she said. The words did not carry threat. They carried reality. Richard absorbed that, his gaze lowering briefly, then lifting again. There was no resistance now, only acceptance. "Then I suppose that is how it should be," he said quietly. Naomi gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Around them, the room continued its slow return to motion. A quiet conversation resumed near the bar. A chair shifted. The music, soft and distant, seemed to find its place again, no longer pushed aside by silence. But something beneath it all had changed, something that would not return to what it had been before. Naomi adjusted the edge of the table slightly, a small, absent gesture, then turned her body just enough to indicate she was ready to leave. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She simply moved when the moment allowed it. Richard watched her, his expression no longer guarded, no longer shaped by control, but by something quieter, something more difficult to name. "Naomi," he said, her name leaving his mouth for the first time, not as a label, but as recognition. She paused, turning her head just enough to acknowledge him, but not fully stepping back into the space they had just left. "Yes," she replied. Richard hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because the words he was searching for did not come easily to someone who had rarely needed them. "Thank you," he said finally, the phrase simple, but carrying more weight than any command he had given that night. Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment, her expression unchanged, but her eyes reflecting. Something softer, something that did not need to be spoken. "Just remember it," she said quietly. The sentence was not a response. It was a direction. Then she turned fully and began to walk, her steps measured, unhurried, the sound of her shoes soft against the marble floor. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. The space opened around her naturally, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Richard remained where he was, watching her go, the reflection of her figure moving across the glass walls until it faded into the background of the room. And in that quiet fading, something settled inside him, not loud, not immediate, but permanent, like a truth that had finally found its place. The space Naomi left behind did not close when she reached the edge of the room. It remained, subtle but unmistakable, like an imprint that refused to fade. Richard Halston stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the path she had taken, even after her figure had blended into the quiet movement of the staff corridor. The glass walls reflected only the room now, but something in that reflection felt incomplete, like a scene missing its center. He exhaled slowly, his breath steady but deeper than before, as if his body was adjusting to something his mind had not fully caught up to yet. Around him, the restaurant resumed its rhythm, but it did so cautiously, like a machine restarting after a sudden halt. A server passed by his table, offering a polite nod that carried a hint of hesitation, then moved on. The small interactions, the ones he used to overlook, now seemed sharper, more present. Richard glanced down at the table again, at the napkin he had unconsciously straightened. It sat perfectly aligned beside the untouched glass, a small detail in a space that had always been about control. But now, it felt different. Not like control, like correction. His fingers hovered over it for a moment, then withdrew, as if he no longer needed to adjust what had already been set right. The guard near the entrance shifted his stance again, then approached slowly, not with urgency, but with purpose. "Sir," he said quietly, stopping a respectful distance from the table. Richard looked up, his gaze steady, but no longer carrying the same expectation. "Yes," he replied. The guard hesitated briefly, then continued. "Do you require anything further?" The question was routine, practiced, but it landed differently now. It did not assume. It offered. Richard held his gaze for a moment, then shook his head once. "No," he said. The word was simple, but it carried a quiet finality. The guard nodded, then stepped back, returning to his position without another word. The system had reset, not to what it was before, but to what it was supposed to be. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture no longer rigid, but not fully relaxed either. Somewhere in between. His eyes drifted across the room, taking in the details he had ignored countless times before. The way the light softened as it moved across the glass. The way people spoke in low tones, careful, measured. The way the staff moved, efficient but almost invisible, maintaining a space that was never meant to draw attention to itself. For a moment, he saw it all differently, not as something he owned, as something he was part of. His gaze returned to the table once more, then beyond it, toward the corridor Naomi had disappeared into. The memory of her voice lingered, not as sound, but as presence. Clear, unshaken. He leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table, his hands loosely clasped, not in control, but in thought. The room continued around him, but he did not move to rejoin it. Not yet. There was a pause, a space between what had happened and what would come next, and for the first time, he did not rush to fill it. Instead, he let it exist. The faint hum of the music returned to his awareness, soft and steady, no longer distant. A glass was lifted at a nearby table, a quiet toast exchanged, life continuing in small, ordinary ways. Richard watched it all without interruption, without influence. Just watching. And in that quiet observation, something settled deeper within him. Not loud, not dramatic, but certain, like a shift in direction that did not need to be announced to be real. He reached for the glass in front of him, not out of habit, but with intention, lifting it slightly, then pausing before taking a sip. The reflection of the room moved across its surface, distorted but present, a reminder of how easily perspective could change when you looked closely enough. He set it back down without drinking. The motion deliberate, almost symbolic. Then he leaned back once more, his gaze steady, his posture grounded, and for the first time that night, he did not try to take control of what came next. He simply allowed it to unfold. The stillness did not break when Richard Halston finally moved. It shifted, subtly, like a surface disturbed just enough to reveal what lay beneath it. He leaned forward again, slower this time, his hands resting flat against the table as if grounding himself in something that no longer felt automatic. The restaurant had returned to motion, but the center of it, the space he occupied, remained quieter than the rest, like a pause that had not fully resolved. He glanced once more toward the corridor Naomi had disappeared into, not expecting her to return, but not fully letting go of the moment either. Then, almost without thinking, he stood. The chair slid back with a soft, controlled sound, not abrupt, but noticeable enough to draw a few brief glances from nearby tables. No one stared. No one spoke. But the awareness lingered, subtle and present. Richard adjusted his jacket, the movement familiar, practiced, but lacking the sharp precision it once carried. He was not preparing to leave as he usually would, with intent and direction. He was adjusting to movement itself, to the idea of stepping into a space that no longer responded to him in the same way. The guard near the entrance straightened slightly as Richard approached, not in deference, but in readiness. "Sir," he said, his tone neutral, steady. Richard paused in front of him, holding his gaze for a moment, not asserting, not questioning, just acknowledging. "You did the right thing," he said. The words came quietly, but they carried weight, not as approval, but as recognition. The guard nodded once, a small movement, but it held something firm beneath it. "Thank you, sir," he replied. Richard continued past him, his steps measured, unhurried, the sound of his shoes against the marble floor echoing just slightly in the open space. Each step felt different, not heavier, but more deliberate, as if he were aware of the ground beneath him in a way he had never needed to be before. He reached the corridor entrance and stopped, not because he was unsure, but because something in him recognized the boundary. This was not his space in the way the dining room had been. This was where the unseen parts of the system existed, the parts that functioned without recognition, without acknowledgement, until moments like this forced them into view. He looked down the hallway, the lighting softer, less curated, more functional. A cart stood against the wall, neatly arranged, its metal surface catching the overhead light in clean, unpolished reflections. For a brief moment, he saw it all clearly. The structure, the layers, the people who moved within it without ever being seen. Naomi had come from here, not as someone out of place, but as someone fully aware of how the entire system worked, from the ground up. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath steady, then stepped forward. Not far, just enough to cross the threshold. A staff member further down the hall glanced up briefly, surprised, then quickly looked away, unsure how to respond. Richard did not stop. He did not call out. He simply stood there, allowing himself to exist in a space he had never entered without purpose before. After a moment, he turned back, retracing his steps into the main room. The shift was immediate. The lighting brighter. The atmosphere controlled. But he was not the same within it. He returned to his table, but did not sit right away. Instead, he rested his hand lightly against the back of the chair, his gaze moving across the room one more time, taking in the details, the movement, the quiet rhythm that continued regardless of who held power within it. Then, slowly, he sat down again, not reclaiming his place, but returning to it with awareness. His hands rested on the table once more, open, still, as if waiting. Not for control, not for resolution, but for whatever came next, knowing now that it would not come from him alone. When Richard Halston sat down again, the chair did not feel the same beneath him. It was the same leather, the same weight, the same precise position relative to the table, but something in the way he occupied it had shifted. He did not lean back into it as before. He sat with intention, his spine straight but not rigid, his hands resting calmly on the surface in front of him, as if he were no longer trying to dominate the space, only to exist within it. The restaurant continued around him, its rhythm restored, but not untouched. Conversations resumed, but softer. Movements continued, but more aware. It was as if the room itself had learned something and had not yet decided how to carry it forward. A server approached cautiously, stopping just short of the table, her posture respectful but uncertain. "Sir," she said gently, "would you like me to refresh your glass?" Richard looked at the glass in front of him, still nearly full, untouched since it had been placed there. He paused, considering not the drink, but the moment. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you." The words came easily, but they did not carry the weight of dismissal. They carried acknowledgement. The server nodded, a small, almost relieved motion, and stepped away without further hesitation. Richard watched her go for a second, noticing the way she moved, efficient, composed, but no longer invisible to him. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, then leaned forward slightly, his gaze returning to the table. The reflection of the overhead light bent across the glass again, but this time he saw more than distortion. He saw how easily something could appear one way from a distance and entirely different up close. His fingers moved slightly, brushing the edge of the napkin once, not to adjust it, but to feel its presence, as if confirming something had changed that could not be undone. Across the room, the guard resumed his post, his stance relaxed but attentive, no longer centered on a single point, but on the room as a whole. The system had settled into its intended balance. Richard's eyes lifted again, scanning the space, not searching for control, but for understanding. He noticed small things now. The way a couple at the far table leaned closer to speak, their voices low, careful. The way a glass caught the light just before it was lifted. The way the staff moved through the room, maintaining order without drawing attention to themselves. These were details he had always relied on, but never truly seen. Until now. He leaned back slightly, his posture easing into something more natural, less constructed. The weight that had settled on him earlier had not lifted, but it had changed shape. It was no longer pressure. It was awareness. A quiet understanding that did not demand immediate action, but would not be ignored. The corridor where Naomi had disappeared remained visible from where he sat, its entrance framed by the same glass and light as the rest of the room, but it felt different now. Not separate, connected, a part of the same system he had once viewed only from above. He held his gaze there for a moment, not expecting her to return, but acknowledging the path she had taken. Then he looked back at the table, his hands resting still once more, his breath steady, his expression composed, but not unchanged. He did not reach for his phone. He did not call for assistance. He did not attempt to restore what had been disrupted. Instead, he allowed the moment to remain as it was, complete in its own way. And in that quiet acceptance, something within him aligned, not with power, not with control, but with the purpose he had once written into a system he had almost forgotten how to follow. The room continued, the night moving forward, but Richard remained still for just a little longer, not because he had nothing to do, but because for the first time, he understood that what mattered most had already begun. The moment did not ask for anything more. It had already given what it came to give, and now it lingered only in the quiet details left behind. Richard Halston remained seated, his posture steady, his hands still resting lightly against the table, but his attention had shifted inward, as if the room around him had softened just enough for him to hear something he had long ignored. The restaurant moved forward, the night reclaiming its rhythm piece by piece. But there was a subtle difference in the way it carried itself, like a place that had witnessed something and would remember it even after the lights dimmed. Richard's gaze lifted once more, drifting toward the glass walls, where reflections overlapped and blurred, turning sharp lines into something less defined. He watched his own reflection for a moment, not as a confirmation of identity, but as a question. The man staring back at him looked the same, dressed the same, composed the same, but there was a stillness in his eyes now that had not been there before. Not emptiness, not uncertainty, something quieter. Awareness. He exhaled slowly, then leaned forward just enough to rest his forearms against the table again, his fingers loosely interlaced, not in control, but in thought. The napkin remained aligned beside the glass, untouched since he last adjusted it. A small reminder of how easily something could be set right once it had been seen clearly. A faint sound came from the corridor again, the soft roll of a cart moving across the floor, then fading, barely noticeable to anyone else. But Richard heard it, and this time, he understood what it represented. Not background noise, not something beneath his attention, part of the structure. Essential. He closed his eyes for a brief second, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement, letting the memory of Naomi's voice settle one last time. Calm, certain, unmoved by the space around her. When he opened them again, the room had not changed. But he had. The guard near the entrance shifted slightly, his stance relaxed, his focus returned to the entire room instead of a single point. The system was steady again. Balanced. Richard noticed it, not as something he commanded, but as something functioning exactly as it should. He reached for the glass once more, this time lifting it slowly, deliberately. The reflection of the room moved across its surface again, but it no longer felt distorted. It felt honest. He held it there for a moment, then took a small sip, the motion simple, unforced, like a quiet acceptance of where he was now. Setting the glass back down, he let his hand rest beside it, fingers relaxed, no longer searching for control. His gaze moved one last time toward the corridor, not expecting to see Naomi again, but recognizing the path she had taken as part of the same space he now occupied. Then he looked forward, not at anything in particular, just ahead, his expression calm, his posture grounded. The night continued around him, conversations rising and falling, glass catching light, footsteps moving in quiet patterns across the floor. But beneath it all, something remained, something that would not fade with time or routine. A shift that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And in that quiet understanding, Richard did not try to reclaim what he had lost. He allowed it to remain changed. Because for the first time, he knew that what mattered was not the power he held in a room like this, but the moment he chose not to use it. And that choice, once made, did not echo loudly. It settled, quietly, into everything that came after. The night moved forward, but it no longer felt like something Richard Halston was directing. It unfolded on its own, steady and indifferent, like a current that did not pause for anyone, no matter how much power they believed they held. He remained seated for a while longer, not out of hesitation, but because leaving too quickly would have felt like denying what had just settled inside him. The glass in front of him caught the light again, a soft reflection bending across its surface, but this time he did not study it. He simply let it be. Around him, the restaurant had fully returned to motion. Conversations layered over one another in low, controlled tones. A server moved past with quiet efficiency, the faint scent of polished wood and citrus trailing behind. The system was intact, but Richard knew now that intact did not mean unchanged. He pushed his chair back slowly and stood again, the movement calm, deliberate, no longer carrying the weight of expectation. No one turned this time. No one paused. The room did not center itself around him. And for the first time, he did not expect it to. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing the fabric across his shoulders, not out of habit, but as a quiet acknowledgement of where he stood now. Then he stepped away from the table. Each step across the marble floor felt grounded, not because the space belonged to him, but because he was aware of it in a way he had never been before. The guard near the entrance glanced at him briefly, then gave a subtle nod, not deferential, not questioning, just present. Richard returned it with a small motion of his head, the exchange simple, balanced. As he reached the exit, he paused for a fraction of a second, his hand resting lightly against the cool metal of the door handle. The glass reflected the room behind him, the soft glow of light, the movement of people, the quiet rhythm that continued without interruption. It looked the same as when he had entered, but it was not. He opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cooler, carrying the faint hum of the city, distant traffic, a low vibration that reminded him the world extended far beyond controlled spaces and curated environments. He stood there for a moment, letting the contrast settle. Inside, everything had been precise, measured, designed. Out here, it moved without permission. He took a breath, deeper than before, filling his lungs with air that did not belong to him. And for once, he did not try to shape it into something else. A car idled at the curb, its engine low and steady, waiting. His driver stepped out, opening the rear door with practiced timing. Richard looked at it, then back at the street, then at the reflection in the window, his own figure standing between two worlds, one he had built and one he had just begun to understand. He shook his head slightly, almost to himself, then lifted a hand in a small gesture. "Give me a minute," he said quietly. The driver nodded and stepped back without question. Richard walked a few steps away from the entrance, not far, just enough to feel the space without structure, without expectation. The pavement beneath his shoes felt different than the marble inside. Less polished, more real. He looked up briefly, the city lights stretching above him, scattered and uneven, nothing like the controlled glow of chandeliers. Then he lowered his gaze again, his expression calm, but changed in a way that did not need to be explained. After a moment, he turned back toward the car, his steps steady, not rushed, not delayed. He entered without hesitation this time, settling into the seat, not with authority, but with quiet acceptance. The door closed softly behind him, the sound final but not heavy. As the car pulled away, the restaurant faded into the background, its lights blending into the city, becoming just another place among many. But what had happened inside did not fade with it. It stayed, not as a memory to revisit, but as something integrated, something that would shape what came next without needing to be announced. And as the car moved forward into the night, Richard did not look back, not because it no longer mattered, but because for the first time, he understood that what mattered most was already moving with him. The city lights stretched across the windshield in long, quiet lines as the car moved forward, each passing glow reflecting briefly against the glass before fading into the dark. Richard Halston sat back in the seat, his posture no longer defined by control or expectation, but by something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. His hands rested loosely in his lap, fingers relaxed, no longer holding tension, no longer reaching for anything to adjust. The hum of the engine beneath him was soft, consistent, a rhythm that did not change based on who sat inside. For a while, he said nothing. He did not reach for his phone. He did not give directions. The driver followed the road ahead, the route familiar, but tonight it felt different, not because the streets had changed, but because he had. His gaze drifted to the window, watching the reflection of the city move alongside him. Buildings rising and falling in quiet patterns, lights blinking on and off in windows where lives unfolded without recognition or control. He studied the reflection of his own face for a moment, not as confirmation, but as awareness. The same features, the same expression, but something behind it had shifted in a way that could not be undone. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, then leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on his knees, not out of restlessness, but intention. The memory of Naomi's voice returned, not as sound, but as presence. Calm, certain, unmoved. He did not replay the words. He did not need to. They had already settled into something deeper than memory. They had become understanding. The car slowed briefly at a light, the red glow washing softly over the interior, then changing to green without urgency. Movement resumed. Continuous. Uninterrupted. Richard leaned back again, his gaze lifting slightly, following the line of the road as it stretched ahead into the night. There was no moment of realization that needed to be declared, no sudden shift that demanded acknowledgement. It had already happened, quietly, without permission, without announcement. And now it simply existed, shaping everything that would follow. He reached up and adjusted his cuff slightly, a familiar gesture, but this time it carried no need for precision. It was just movement, just presence. Outside, a pedestrian crossed the street, unhurried, unnoticed by most. But Richard watched for a second longer than necessary, not out of curiosity, but recognition. The world did not pause. It did not wait for anyone to understand it. It moved, steady and indifferent, and it was up to each person within it to decide how they would exist inside that motion. The car turned onto a quieter street, the lights softer, the noise more distant, the city settling into a different rhythm. Richard closed his eyes briefly, not in fatigue, but in acknowledgement, letting the silence inside the car settle around him without resistance. When he opened them again, nothing outside had changed, but he no longer expected it to. He sat there, still, grounded, aware, and for the first time in a long time, he did not think about what he controlled, or what he owned, or what responded to him. He thought about what he had chosen, and what that choice meant moving forward. The car continued into the night, steady, uninterrupted, carrying him forward not as a man defined by the space he commanded, but as someone who had finally understood the space he occupied. And in that quiet understanding, there was no need for anything more. Not a statement, not a correction, just a shift, held in silence, shaping everything that came after without ever needing to be seen.